Chapter 20. The Drowned Land of Reimerswaal. Reimerswaal, County of Zeeland, 1622. Lieselotte walked toward the sea, still wearing a fouled and bloodied shift over her worn-out gown. Her hands and arms were sticky with blood. Strands of ginger hair spilled generously from her cotton cap. This was indecent, but at this moment, with the world turned upside down as it was, Lieselotte simply couldn't care less. She was only accompanied by Katja, whose simple dress and apron were as disheveled as Lieselotte's clothes. The farm girl, a year or two short of Lieselotte's 15, had lost her cap altogether. The thick braids of her long, sunny hair had long lost tightness, the original design hard to discern. We were under fire, Lieselotte mused. Again, Peter was hit. Treating the gunshot wound had exhausted her. She was pleased to be out of the gloom of the dry ruin they had found shelter in, so that she could tend her cousin. The boys could keep an eye out on Peter for a while. Lieselotte wanted out of Reimerswaal's decay, away from the surreal and fearful sight of the sea flowing in and out of half-submerged streets, inhabited only by fish. It was good to breathe fresh air in the narrow length of dunes west of the drowned city. Stopping briefly where dunes and broad sand beach met, Lieselotte kicked off her shoes and worked off her stockings. She laid her belt and haversack on the ground and then removed the makeshift apron and her gown, leaving her clad in her undershift. "Coming?" she asked Katja. The girl shook her head and lowered herself onto the soft flank of the dune instead. "I'll keep a lookout." Lieselotte walked to the surf, the loose sand beneath her bare feet gaining firmness. She stopped just short of where the low, rolling waves tumbled onto the beach. The sand was cold and wet. She wriggled her toes, and her feet sank a little, water and sand creeping over the sides. The water felt far colder than Lieselotte would have liked. She shivered at the thought of exposing more than her feet to the sea's chill. However, a desire to wash was stronger. Taking a deep breath for courage, Lieselotte broke into a run, splashing through the low choppy waves until the water rose to her thighs. There she dove headlong into the sea, completely submerging herself. She gasped when she resurfaced. Sure, she would freeze to death. She washed as quickly as possible and then ran back up the beach. Her teeth were chattering when she reached the embrace of the dry blanket Katja had thought to bring. Lieselotte wrapped herself in the wool folds, which countered the chill on her wet skin. It was good to be cleanish, even though the salty water would leave her hair stiff and unmanageable. Lieselotte picked up the bloodied shift and shook it out for examination. She sighed, doubting she'd ever get the stains out. No spare shifts left. But there are worse things, like soldiers, Spanish or Dutch. She shivered as she recollected the near escapes of late. It was safe for the moment, on this desolate miniature isle between the Duchy of Brabant and the many islands that made up Zeeland. But what to do next? Lieselotte had no idea how to proceed, although she was keenly aware the burden of that decision now rested on her shoulders. But who am I to make decisions for all of us? I'm just me. A steady roll of distant thunder rolled across the sea, an ominous reminder of war's proximity. We can't stay here. The Spanish army is too close. A sound blended in with the rumbling of the artillery and the steady low rush of the sea, the same sound they had heard that morning. It was the chime of a chapel bell, joined in by more, as well as the deeper tolls of larger church bells. Oddly enough, the tolling seemed to be coming from the sea inlet, not the land to either side of it. If they had continued sailing toward the bells in the morning, they would have headed away from land out onto a mist-shrouded sea in the aging yawl. Recalling Katja's reaction in the morning mist, Lieselotte looked at her young travel companion. It was a relief to note her new friend showed no sign of the panic she had displayed earlier at the sound of the bells. Instead, Katja gazed warily into the haze over the sea. Lieselotte turned her head that way to see the mist over the sea recede. It remained hazy along the Zeeland and Brabant shores on either side of the sea inlet, but looking straight over the water, Lieselotte could see for miles. It was a strange landscape. A great mass of small choppy waves as could be expected, but here and there tall rectangular silhouettes rose from the water like giant monolithic gravestones. The sight caused a tingle to run up and down Lieselotte's spine. Church towers. The drowned land of Reimerswaal, her young companion spoke solemnly. She pointed at one of the towers. That was the church of the village of Duvenet. Over there, Kouwerve. She continued her inventory, pointing at the towers. Kreke, that big one, Nieuwkerke. There was Tolsende. What happened here? Lieselotte asked. I can't see any houses. Who is ringing the bells? No one is, miss. No one? Is it just me? Can you hear them ringing? I've heard them before, miss, now as well. But someone has to be ringing them. Miss, Katja hesitated. There are no bells. No bells? How? They took them away, to make cannon to defend Bergen op Zoom. On cue, cannons rumbled menacingly from the direction of the besieged city. Lieselotte stared intently at the nearest tower. All that remained was the eroded shell of the bare brickwork. Yet a bell tolled insistently from the tower, loud and clear. A bell that isn't there. She folded her arms around herself and shivered, rung by no one. Katja, what happened here? To Reimerswaal, the drowned land. You don't know? Katja was astonished. I'm not from here. Oosterhout was far away. Rotterdam so far it seemed wholly out of reach. Worlds apart from Zeeland at any rate. Please tell me. It's a long story, miss. The chiming and the tolling of the bells slowed, and then ceased altogether. The surf's crash and seabirds' cries seemed to mourn their passing. A long story suited Lieselotte. A human voice to distract her from the loneliness of an island saddened by melancholy and whispering of long-gone glory days. Days when there had been life here instead of desolation. Tell me. Katja began to tell, hesitant at first, but soon gaining a confidence that suggested she had heard the story often enough to be able to recite it from memory, using far more complex language than Lieselotte had heard her use before. 100 years ago, Reimerswaal was the third city of Zeeland, a rich city surrounded by rich land. Lord Lodiek and his wife Johanna had a son called Bartoon. They lived in Lodi Castle, not far from the city. Over there, Katja pointed west, where the last of the dunes fell away to mark the end of the small island. Lieselotte could see a similar but smaller ridge of the dunes across the stretch of water forming another miniature island. Katja continued. Bartoon was handsome to look at, with hazel eyes and brown curls. His skin was browned by the sun because he spent much of his time outdoors, hunting, swimming, wrestling, and learning his swordplay. He wore the finest clothing because his parents spoiled him. When Bartoon rode the land, folk would point as he passed and say, "There goes our prince." One summer, when Bartoon was 16, he went out riding near the castle. He heard a strange and unexpected sound. It was a girl's voice, and she was singing. The voice was so beautiful that Bartoon thought an angel must have come down from heaven. He rode his horse to the banks of the Oosterschelde to see who owned the enchanting voice. What he saw bewitched him. A girl, his own age, up to her waist in the river, singing while she washed her hair. Her skin was white as a lily, her breast perfectly rounded, her hair golden as if spun from sunrays, and her eyes the color of the sea. When she saw Bartoon staring at her, she smiled and waved, inviting him to join her. Bartoon didn't hesitate. He dismounted, took off his finery, and ran into the water. The girl told him her name was Hille, and she seemed to like Bartoon as much as he liked her. They teased, laughed, and frolicked in the water like two other cubs at play. They went deeper into the water, but never did Hille go near to the shallows of the riverbank. Bartoon gave it no thought. He was smitten, drunk on her presence. When Hille told Bartoon it was time for her to go home, he begged her for a kiss. Katja stopped telling, giggling instead. Go on, Lieselotte urged. What happened? They did this kissing thing. Ew. Bah! Katja scrunched up her nose. They kissed. Lieselotte sighed dreamily. Her mind's eye pictured the unlikely pair, Bartoon dark as the earth and Hille light as the sky, shyly pressing their lips together. Tss! Katja rolled her eyes before she continued. Bartoon was so bewitched by Hille that he couldn't bear to be parted from her. He asked her to come back to Lodi Castle with him. Hille laughed and told Bartoon that he was sweet, but this was impossible. She didn't say why. Bartoon assumed she didn't want to, because he couldn't imagine anything being impossible. He always got what he wanted. None but his father dared to say nay to the future lord of Reimerswaal. He repeated that he wanted to take Hille home, and again was met by gentle refusal. This time Bartoon became angry. He took hold of her arm and demanded that Hille go with him. "What a rotten bilge rat!" Lieselotte exclaimed. I think he was, Katja agreed, and Hille now found out he was. She became angry and struggled to break free from Bartoon's grip. They wrestled, but this time it wasn't in fun play. This time it was serious. Bartoon was surprised at Hille's strength. Even as they fought, there were times she managed to pull him deeper into the water. He realized why when he finally succeeded in forcing her out of the water onto the riverbank. He nearly let go of her in surprise because... well, where her legs ought to have been, he saw a great fishtail, the scales shimmering in all hues of blues, greens, and silver. I knew it! Hille was a mermaid. Yeah, she was. When he had recovered from his surprise, Bartoon tied Hille up and laid her across the saddle of his horse. He brought her back to Lodi Castle in triumph, boasting that he had captured one of the merfolk, and everyone was much amazed. Lord Lodique ordered a large wooden cage built. They put Hille in the cage and lowered the cage into the castle moat so that she could be in water. At first, she hissed and spat at her captors. Then she swam into the farthest corner of the cage and turned her face away from all those who came to gaze upon her. That night, Hille started singing again. This time it wasn't a beautiful, enchanting song. This time it was a dirge she sang in plaintive notes. Bartoon complained that he couldn't sleep. His father ordered some of his retainers to tie a gag around Hille's mouth to silence her. They bound her hands as well, so that she couldn't undo the gag. Poor Hille, Lieselotte commiserated. To be caged. Hille hadn't deserved to be locked up and scorned. Katja nodded. But what Lord Lodique didn't know was that Hille wasn't just any mermaid. She was the daughter of Nolliken and Dremelin, the king and queen of the merfolk. Lieselotte liked the sound of that. She hoped that Bartoon and his father would be punished. King Nolliken and Queen Dremelin despaired when Hille didn't come home. They swam around all of Zeeland, but none of the merfolk or sea creatures they asked could tell them where their daughter was. There was no other choice for the king and queen. They had to engage with the landfolk, whom they usually avoided. King Nolliken went to Steenbergen, presented himself off the quay, and humbly begged for information. Now, as it happened, the folk of Steenbergen had already heard of Hille's capture, but they were devout Christians and took the merfolk to be demons in league with the devil himself, so they gave no answer to poor King Nolliken, other than laugh at his desperation. Bastards, Lieselotte commented. Yeah, miss, they were. But not all landfolk were. Queen Dremelin went to Bergen op Zoom and hailed the city folk from the harbor. She found a kinder reception. She was offered refreshments because they could see she was tired from her efforts to find Hille. Then they told the queen that her daughter was held captive in the moat of Lodi Castle. She thanked them and summoned her husband and all her subjects to the Oosterschelde riverbank near the castle. They arrived late in the evening and they were told by a dolphin there that Hille's dirge had been heard the previous night, but that all had been silent since. Fearing the worst, King Nolliken and Queen Dremelin struck up the same keening dirge, joined by all the other merfolk who had emerged from the depths. Once again Bartoon complained that he couldn't sleep. This time he was scared as well, because it sounded like there were hundreds of Hilles lamenting their grief all at once. They soon discovered that it wasn't Hille who was singing, for she was still secure in her cage, hands bound, mouth gagged, eyes wide. The noise was coming from the river. Alarmed, Lord Lodique urged his retainers to arm themselves. He arrived at the Oosterschelde riverbank astride his warhorse, wearing his best armor and followed by a small army of helmeted and breastplated men armed with swords, spears and crossbows. Lady Johanna and Bartoon came along as well. There was a battle, Lieselotte whispered. Not at first, miss, only a battle of words. King Nolliken asked Lord Lodique for the release of Hille, as a courtesy from one lord to another lord. Lord Lodique laughed loudly, and then told King Nolliken that a domain made of muddy sandbanks couldn't hope to compare itself to the rich land of Reimerswaal. Then Queen Dremelin appealed to Lady Johanna to release Hille as a mother's mercy. Lady Johanna scorned the merfolk queen. She said that Bartoon was a devout Christian who couldn't be compared to a grotesque monstrosity like Hille. She is mine now, Bartoon cried out. You can't have her back. Those people were horrible. Yeah, miss, they were cruel. They laughed cruelly when the king and queen begged for their daughter's release. They laughed when the queen offered them the wealth of the sea for Hille's safe return. There is no wealth which I don't already possess, boasted Lord Lodique. There is nothing you can give me. At that, Nolliken and Dremelin became very quiet. Then the king hissed, There are things we can take away. Lord Lodique laughed at him and said, Then I'll invite you to come ashore and try. At that, Queen Dremelin rose higher out of the water, spread her arms and spoke a curse. Bergen op Zoom will prosper and grow. For Steenbergen nothing but woe, and o'er Reimerswaal streets I shall dart through seaweeds. Lieselotte shivered, her mind's eye conjuring up the half-submerged streets of the drowned city. A merfolk curse was not something to be taken lightly. Lord Lodique, his family, and all their men laughed again. Then King Nolliken and Queen Dremelin, as well as all the other merfolk, disappeared. In into the Oosterschelde. Far to the west the sky rumbled and lightning shot through dark clouds. The Lodijk family went back to the castle, but Lord Lodijk took the precaution of posting guards on the sea dike by the Oosterschelde and by Hille's cage in the moat. All seemed calm again, but deep in the night that distant storm reached the land of Reimerswaal. The wind howled around the castle towers. A vicious rain whipped the land and the guards outside. The storm clouds hurled down bolts of lightning. These shook the castle foundations when they impacted nearby and deafened those within the castle and the village of Lodijk and then the rest of Reimerswaal. Boertje indicated the sea inlet in front of them. Lord Lodijk was urged to raise the general alarm, upon which all able-bodied men would be mobilized to guard the outer sea dikes. But the Lord of Reimerswaal was a proud man, and concerned people would say he feared the Merfolk. "The dikes will hold," he said. "No alarm." He did order the guards to be withdrawn, because he deemed any hostile action by the Merfolk to be pure insanity in the horrible weather. "That probably wasn't very smart of him," Lieselotte suggested. "Nay, it wasn't. But there wasn't much they could have done. Merfolk fight their wars differently from us landfolk. The tide was driven in from the sea by the storm. The waters around the land of Reimerswaal rose fast, waves assaulting the dikes, sheets of spray whipped up and over the dike tops, and the Merfolk were hard at work below." "Work?" Lieselotte asked, although she could guess. "Digging, clawing away the earth. At Lodijk Dijk, but in other places as well, all around the land of Reimerswaal. To dig through a whole dike. They didn't need to, miss. They just needed to cause a small breach. After that, they let the sea do the work. The water broke through with such force that the breach grew wider quickly until there was a long gap, which is called Lodijk Gap to this day. It's right behind that last big dune over there. The Merfolk came in with the water that rushed through. The inner polder dikes were weaker than the outer sea dikes. The Merfolk dug breach after breach until the whole of Reimerswaal was swallowed up by the raging sea, even in the city, where the water reached the market square, as you have seen for yourself." Lieselotte stared at the monolithic towers rising from the sea. She envisaged the horrors of that night as the ravenous flood cascaded down upon unsuspecting villages and farms. Those poor people. 18 villages drowned that night, Katja said, as well as Lodijk Castle and part of the city. The castle? Did the Merfolk find Hille? Hille was freed. Lord Lodijk and Lady Johanna managed to escape to Bergen-op-Zoom. All the riches the Lord Reimerswaal had boasted of were lost to the sea. His people were drowned or dispersed. He never returned and died in poverty. Bartoon was dragged to the Oosterschelde by Merfolk, screaming his head off. They pulled him under water, and that was the last that was seen of him. Lieselotte was glad of that. But that satisfaction was much diminished by the knowledge that the entire population of Reimerswaal had paid a high price for their lord's pride and cruelty. There must have been untold hundreds of people in those 18 villages. The alarm hadn't been raised. They would have thought themselves safe, up to the moment the angry sea had roared through the doors and windows, blocking any means of escaping the ferocious water. Lieselotte shivered again. While Katja had told the story, the girl had run a hand through the sand, letting it spill between her fingers. As the story progressed, she had uncovered part of a larger item and had been slowly sweeping it clear of sand. Lieselotte hadn't paid attention to the details of Katja's absent-minded handiwork, her mind occupied by images conjured up by Katja's words. She glanced at it when Katja lifted it from the sand. It was a long carved whalebone, like a spearhead, but with a great many barbs of different lengths and thickness, all of which suggested a vicious ability to maim and kill. Though the hole was smoothed by sea and sand, the spiky barb still looked sharp. Despite that deadly aspect, it was curiously elegant and ornamental. "What in the name of orange is that?" Lieselotte asked. "A Merfolk weapon," Katja said without doubt. "We find them now and then, back at home too. Here, have it." "Thank you." Lieselotte took the Merfolk weapon with reverence. She could barely believe she was holding part of a deadly weapon once wielded by a merman or mermaid, maybe even in the battle to free Hille from Lodijk Castle. The carefully crafted whalebone lent Katja's story a sense of reality that was breathtaking. Chapter 21. The Blood Oath. Reimerswaal, County of Zeeland, 1622. A battery near Bergen-op-Zoom fired in quick succession. The echo of the booms drifted over the sea, as did renewed and encroaching mist, already concealing the farthest church towers. The bells started tolling again, mournfully so. Lieselotte tore her eyes away from the merfolk spear blade and looked at her young companion, who looked tired from telling the long tale. "Thank you for telling me that story, Katja." "Of course, miss. You must call me Lieselotte, none of this miss business." Katja colored red and shook her head. "I can't." "Why not?" "I'm just a simple flatlander," Katja blurted out. You... The girl looked at Lieselotte with such frank admiration that it made Lieselotte feel uncomfortable. "You're like Hille, miss. When you were in the sea just now," Katja said. "So beautiful, and you know all these things. So much, even surgery." Fierce pride invigorated Lieselotte. The full realization of what she had done on that small islet by the Eendracht River. "If I can treat a gunshot wound, I can also take over from Peter until he's better." "How old are you, Katja?" 13, I think, miss." "We're only a few years apart," Lieselotte smiled. "Just call me by my name. I think we shall become good friends." Katja smiled shyly. "But..." "No buts," Lieselotte decreed. "You see the differences between us, Katja. I see the similarities. We're both adrift, with uncertain futures. Bleak futures, which are not ours to control. My future isn't uncertain," Katja said proudly. "I'm going to be a handmaid in Rotterdam." Lieselotte laughed, then looked at the distant towers. Their number was diminishing in the mist, their tolling bells dying down again. "So, who rings the bells, the ones that don't exist?" "Folks say that on some nights you can hear the panic shouts of men, screams of women and wailing of children, and that those doomed folk ring the bells in alarm, summoning help that will never come." Lieselotte felt a chill crawl along her spine. "Others say that you can hear the merfolk sing, that it is they who ring the bells to lure unknowing folk to watery graves." Lieselotte could well believe it, overlooking what had once been a battlefield between human and merfolk. The warning was clear. It was better not to underestimate the power of the merfolk. On an impulse, holding the barbed merfolk spearhead at a safe distance so as to not accidentally cut herself on the wicked barbs, Lieselotte threw off the blanket. She pulled out her Javanese cuirass, which she had called Eon, then drew the blade from its sheath, which she left on the bag. Eon, mermaid, queen of the South Sea. Hille, daughter of the king and queen of the Zeeuwse merfolk. Lieselotte rose to her feet and walked down the beach toward the receding waterline, her mermaid cuirass in one hand, the merfolk spearhead in the other. "Miss? Lieselotte?" Katja got to her feet and followed Lieselotte down the beach, though at a wary distance. "Don't worry, Katja. I know what I'm doing." She didn't really. It was intuition. If merfolk had the power to curse, they also had the power to bless. Landfolk deemed that it was Lieselotte's duty to meekly accept she was someone else's legal property. Bartoon had reasoned Hille was his rightful property, a view that hadn't been shared by the merfolk. When Lieselotte reached the edge of the sea, Katja urged her to stop. "Miss, you mustn't. Better stay away from the water when the bells of the drowned land have just tolled. They could begin again." Lieselotte ignored her and walked into the sea until the waves lapped at her ankles. The bells had fallen silent, so all she could hear was the occasional rumble of cannons at Bergen-op-Zoom, the gentle surf, the whispering winds, and the seabirds crying out forlornly. It didn't take much imagination for those cries to assume the nature of a merfolk dirge. If those mysterious creatures existed still, they would be found here, at the edge of the drowned land of Reimerswaal. Lieselotte raised Eon high. Although there was no sun that she could see, the wavy blade of the cuirass shimmered nonetheless, its spiraling pattern seemingly alive, like a mermaid's tail. She thrust the spearhead up. The smooth bone polished by sea and sand gleamed. Lieselotte crossed steel and bone. The breeze didn't feel so cold now, but Lieselotte's skin tingled, and she felt goosebumps on her arms and legs. "Hille of the merfolk," Lieselotte called out, her voice loud and clear. "I beseech you to listen to me." "Oh dear Mary, Mother of God," Katja uttered. "My life!" Lieselotte shouted over the water, then dropped into a whisper. "Hille, please help me live my life, my own life, as I choose it. Then, at the end, it will be yours." Without giving herself time to think about it, Lieselotte clamped the spearhead between her knees to free her left hand and pressed Eon's blade against her palm. The steel was razor sharp and broke the skin easily. Lieselotte completed the cut before she even felt the pain. Gritting her teeth, she formed her left hand into a fist and squeezed it. She watched in fascination as a steady trickle of blood dripped down from her fist into the sea, where the bright red drops quickly diluted with the water to form vague stains that were pulled backward before disappearing, consumed by the sea. When the trickle of blood ceased, Lieselotte dipped her left hand into the water. The sting of the salt water was such that she couldn't help but cry out in pain. "Miss Lieselotte!" Katja shouted in alarm. Lieselotte took hold of the spearhead again, clutching it tight despite the pain, turned around, grimacing. "I'm all right. It just hurt a little." Katja stared at her with wide eyes. "That wasn't Christian. It was something I needed to do," Lieselotte said with conviction. She walked back to her companion. Katja looked aghast. "There's no harm done, Katja," Lieselotte assured her. "Don't seafarers still honor Neptune? Some things are older, much older, like your Oma's wisdom." "Neptune?" The girl looked confused. "Never mind, just don't tell anyone," Lieselotte concluded, sliding Eyang back into the sheath. She recalled what Peter had said. "They're burning folk at the stake for less all over Europe." "I won't," Katja promised, her doubts replaced by a fierce loyalty that made Lieselotte smile as she carefully tucked Eyang and the Merfolk spearhead into the haversack. "Good on you," Lieselotte said cheerfully, "and thank you, Katja. And now, I suppose we better get back to the others. Tell them what I've decided to do, my earlier plan. Peter yearns for his ship, and a woman, I think, in Flushing. He's in love. Christina? Davy? Love is a powerful medicine. We have to get him to Flushing." The two made their way back up into the dunes. After their voices died away in the distance, the only sounds that remained were the occasional booms from the batteries around Bergen op Zoom, the cries of seabirds, the eternal rush of the sea, and something faint that sounded like an otherworldly song.
Epilogue. Reimerswaal, Zeeland, 1622. Come morning, a great many unexpected and most unwelcome visitors forced Lieselotte and her companions to depart in a hurry. Although Lieselotte didn't spend much time in the Reimerswaal, her blood oath will bind her to the drowned land forevermore. The small party heads deeper into Zeeland, ever onward to Flushing, onward to the shipyard where Peter's brainchild, a ship like no other, awaits them. Much as the Zeeland legend of Reimerswaal has been interwoven into Lieselotte's tale, her own narrative forms part of another story. Little does she know that Peter's ship is the very craft that, 400 years later, you and I know all too well. It's the ship that still strikes fear into stout oak hearts of sailors on the seven seas. The ship that haunts seafarers still, a demon at the helm and a devil in their dreams. Unbeknownst to Lieselotte, her own story forms an integral part of the origin story of the Flying Dutchman.
This broadcast was based on 2 chapters from Nils Visser's novel The Flying Dutchman, Bleak Future. This story has been 375 years in the making. It started in 1646 when Willem Ysbrandzoon Bontekoe published a journal of his Asian travels. This work formed a major inspiration for German author Philipp Koebe when he wrote Der Vliegende Hollander in 1849. Koebe's work inspired Dutch author Piet Visser to write The Vliegende Hollander in 1901.
Inspired by both Willem Ysbrandzoon Bontekoe and Piet Visser, Johan Fabricius wrote The Scheepsjongens van Bontekoe, first published in 1924 and translated into English under the title Java Ho. This novel has been reprinted 34 times and sold an estimated 300,000 copies. An award-winning feature film was made in 2007. I must have read Java Ho 100 times as a young lad in the 1970s and 1980s, and that is no exaggeration. Like Johan Fabricius, I grew up in Asia and readily identified with the main characters. Still blissfully unaware of the darkest sides of our colonial past at that time, my own experience suggested that young Dutch lad swanning about Asia was as normal as could be. At long last, my copy of The Scheepsjongens van Bontekoe fell apart, literally read to pieces. and that phase of my life seemed over. Until 2018 that was, when I discovered that Piet Visser was my great-granduncle. I got my hands on a copy of his De Vliegende Hollander and then discovered the multiple Bontekoe connections.
When Nils Visser read his great-granduncle's novel in 2018, he decided to rewrite the story in English for a contemporary audience.
The amount of research that was to be done was daunting. Looking into those first Dutch sea voyages to the East Indies, as well as the Dutch War of Independence from Spain, the 80 Years' War, I encountered the Defragged History YouTube channel. The Batavia series was sensational, helped by the context of a psychopath left in charge of shipwreck survivors, many of whom did not survive his reign of terror. The 80 Years' War series started soon after, delivered in the same impeccable style and manner. I listened to the episodes again and again. They were a great way to immerse myself in the time period when writing. And of course, I relished the fact that someone had conducted a lion's share of the research already, leaving me free to hyper-focus on Lieselot's journey and places she was likely to pass on her journey to Flushing, like Reimerswaal and its associated legends. Other than being marked by thorough research, the Defragged History episodes are well written and presented in a fantastic manner. Narrator Yvette Boertje has a superb style of delivery. She uses intonation and tempo in a theatrical manner to indicate rising excitement or tragic unfolding of events. Occasional references to modern culture or the use of modern slang work extremely well, inserting well-timed comic relief. I much recommend subscribing to the Defragged History channel. On an impulse, I sent a spontaneous email, more or less along the following lines. Hi, you don't know me, but I think you're awesome and should consider reading fiction as well. Here's a story of mine that I think you might like. Seconds after pressing send, I realized that this email would be considered as slightly insane at best, not to mention somewhat awkward. What I didn't know was that Yvette has strong family connections to the drowned land of Reimerswaal and knows the area well. Moreover, she is a blood relative of one of the historical characters in the novel. This young audacious chap will appear in the next chapter, briefly setting foot on Reimerswaal Island to meet Lieselot. His name is Michiel Adriaanszoon, and although just a teenager in 1622, he is already on his way to establishing his remarkable reputation. To my surprise, delight and gratitude, Yvette responded with an, "Okay, let's do this. I'll read this story of yours." And here we are.
And everyone was much amazed.
Well, by my reckoning, they ought to be. Thank you for tuning in, and I wish you fair winds. May your ship's course keep you clear of
The Flying Dutchman.
The Flying Dutchman.
On this day, as every day before, the captain's log reads the same. It has for the last 400 years nothing to report forevermore. Many stayed forever, buried neath the waves, but no such mercy for the Dutchman's crew, chained to their wretched hearse with an everlasting curse. Hey ho, we are the Dutchman's crew, can moan, groan, weep and wail until your face turns blue. Your soul will be devoured whole. There's a demon at the helm, it seems, and a devil in your dreams. They're seeking to discharge their cursed load, but no sloop will near the rotten hull. No gull can screech loud enough to overpower shrill screams. For the wind against the wind, or no wind at all, ash grey sails will billow. No storm or hurricane can sink her, no warship's cannon inflict defeat. Hey ho, we are the Dutchman's crew, you can moan, groan, weep and wail until your face turns blue. Your soul will be devoured whole. There's a demon at the helm, it seems, and a devil in your dreams. Whisper will of the waves, hull glowing ghostly green. Stern and prow lights ablaze, few live to tell the tale of threadbare tattered sail, decks stare battered by the waves. of paint rest a few last fading flakes, once proud colours, now ragged greys. Hey ho, we are the Dutchman's crew. You can moan, groan, weep and wail until your face turns blue. Your soul will be devoured whole. There's a demon at the helm, it seems, and a devil in your dreams. There's a demon at the helm, it seems, and a devil in your dreams.